The morning arrived at Blackwood Manor, not as a herald of light, but as a creditor demanding payment in a currency the house no longer possessed. Grey and unyielding, the dawn seeped through the tall, grime-streaked windows of the east wing, illuminating the fine dance of dust motes that had become Elara Vance's only consistent companions. The air here was heavy with the scent of unlit tallow and the faint, biting tang of damp slate, a smell that spoke of a structure slowly surrendering its bones to the earth. Within the center of the draughty chamber, Elara stood as still as a statue in a cathedral, her spine a perfectly straight line that defied the heavy, suffocating weight of the lace veil being draped over her head. Baroness Beatrice moved around her with the predatory grace of a woman who viewed every person as a ledger entry to be manipulated or erased. Her fingers, encased in silk gloves that were beginning to fray at the seams, were cold as they tucked the heavy fabric beneath Elara's chin, ensuring that not a single inch of the silvery mark trailing toward her jaw remained visible. This scar, a legacy of the fire that had claimed the estate's prosperity 7 years prior, was the secret the family intended to bury alongside the family's mounting debts. "You will remain here, Elara," Beatrice said, her voice like the dry rustle of parchment. "The Duke of Sterling is not a man who tolerates imperfection, and your presence in the drawing room would be a liability we cannot afford. Silas requires a loan, and that loan depends entirely upon the illusion of our family's unblemished standing. Do you understand?" Elara did not answer immediately. Her gaze was fixed upon a single loose thread hanging from the hem of Beatrice's gown, a deep plum silk that was clearly 2 seasons out of fashion. Despite the cruelty of the woman before her, Elara's fingers twitched with a reflexive, ingrained competence. For years, she had been the invisible architect of the household's remaining dignity, mending what was broken and calculating the exact cost of every candle and loaf of bread. She wanted to reach out, to take a pair of shears and a needle, and secure that thread before it unraveled the entire garment. It was a habit of the mind, a scrupulous need for order that the rest of her family had long ago abandoned in favor of vanity. "I understand that I am the price of Silas's profligacy," Elara replied, her voice steady and clear, possessing an intellectual spark that no amount of lace could dampen. "But hide me as you will, mother, the ledgers do not lie. The rot in the foundations of this house is not found in my face, but in the accounts my brother refuses to balance." Beatrice's hand stilled for a brief heartbeat, her eyes narrowing. The truth was an unwelcome guest at Blackwood Manor. She gave the veil a final, sharp tug, nearly catching Elara's skin. The Baroness did not care for the integrity of the soul. She cared only for the facade of the title. With a final, disdainful glance at the shadowed corner where the Blackwood ledger lay hidden beneath a stack of old linens, Beatrice turned and walked toward the door. The transition from the chamber to the hallway was a study in coldness. As Beatrice stepped across the threshold, she reached into the velvet folds of her skirt and produced the silver skeleton key. It was an object of exquisite craftsmanship, cold and heavy, representing the absolute authority of the gatekeeper. Elara watched from behind the dark mesh of her veil as the Baroness stepped into the corridor, her shadow stretching long and distorted across the floorboards. The sound that followed was one Elara would feel in the marrow of her bones for years to come. The heavy oak door, thick enough to muffle any plea, swung shut with a groan of protesting hinges. Then came the click, not a mere noise, but a sharp, mechanical finality that vibrated through the air and into Elara's very teeth. It was the sound of a social burial. The intricately wrought master key turned in the lock, and with that rotation, Elara Vance ceased to exist in the eyes of the ton, the county, and the guests who would soon fill the main house with their hollow laughter. The silence that rushed into the room after the retreating footsteps of the Baroness died away was not empty. It was a silence that had teeth, a predatory quiet. Instead of sinking into the despair that was expected of her, Elara reached up and slowly pushed back the veil. She did not need to see her reflection to know who she was. She walked toward the small, scarred desk in the corner, her movements precise and unhurried. The mansion stood in agonizing suspense, waiting for the arrival of Julian Sterling, the man of granite and silence. But as Elara opened the heavy cover of the Blackwood ledger and dipped her quill into the ink, she knew something the rest of her family did not. Doors were meant to be opened, and numbers, unlike people, always eventually demanded the truth. She began to write, her focus narrowing until the rest of the manor ceased to exist. The tallow candle was a wretched, guttering thing, an inexpensive stub that wept yellow grease onto the scarred surface of the mahogany desk as she worked. It was the only light allowed in her confinement, a meager flicker that fought against the encroaching shadows of a room that the rest of Blackwood Manor had chosen to forget. Elara Vance sat perfectly still, her spine as straight as the columns of figures she had spent the last 4 hours agonizing over. The air in this part of the house was thin, tasting of old dust and the slow, inevitable rot of damp slate. Here, the silence did not merely exist. It possessed a weight that pressed against the skin. She dipped her quill into the inkpot once more. Her fingers stained a permanent, scholarly black at the tips. To the rest of her family, it was a tedious chore, a necessary evil that recorded the slow evaporation of their prestige. To Elara, however, it was the one honest room in the world. Numbers did not care for the silver-white scar that trailed from her temple down to her jaw, a jagged legacy of the fire 7 years prior. Numbers did not flinch when the light caught her profile, or suggest that she wear a heavier veil to spare the sensibilities of the kitchen staff. On these pages, the world was logical, balanced, and scrupulously fair. But as she moved her quill down the latest entry in the hand of her brother Silas, the coldness in her chest deepened into something sharper than the winter draft. She paused, her breath hitching as she identified the discrepancy. Silas Vance was not merely an incompetent administrator. He was mathematically malevolent. With the clinical precision of a surgeon, Elara tracked the flow of capital that had supposedly been allocated for the repair of the tenant cottages. It had not vanished into the soil or the stone. Instead, the figures twisted and turned through a series of creative deductions until they settled into a private account that Silas kept for his London excursions. He was stealing from his own mother, stripping the very bones of the estate to pay for silk waistcoats and gambling debts at the clubs. Elara calculated the interest on their primary loan, a debt held by the Sterling family that had sat like a leaden weight on Blackwood for a generation, and realized that the next payment was not merely late. It was impossible. Unless she corrected the underlying arithmetic and found a way to bridge the gap, the house would not simply be poor. It would be solvent only in its ruin. In the library 3 floors below, the atmosphere was a sharp, biting contrast to the disciplined stillness of the neglected wing. Silas Vance stood before the fireplace, his face flushed with a mixture of brandy and mounting irritation as he threw a stack of crumpled correspondence across the desktop. He was a man of expensive tastes and a hollowed-out spirit, his frock coat fitting him with a precision that his accounts entirely lacked. He was looking for the ghost of a book, the very ledger that Elara was currently using to document his ruin. He had searched the primary study, the safe behind the portrait of the 3rd Earl, and even the drawers of the morning room. Yet the documentation for his latest financial scheme remained elusive. Every minute the Sterling debt remained uncalculated was a minute he spent in a cold sweat, fearing the arrival of the Duke. The door to the library swung open with a sharp, authoritative click. Baroness Beatrice entered the room, her silk skirts hissing against the floorboards like a warning. She was a woman who lived by the rigid geometry of social standing, her hair silvered and coiffed into a crown that seemed too heavy for her narrow neck. She looked at her son, then at the footstool he had just kicked aside in his frustration. She did not chide him for the violence of the act, nor for the profligate waste of the brandy in his glass. Her concern was far more localized. She smoothed the lace at her cuffs, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of disorder that might offend a guest of high rank. To Beatrice, a family's worth was measured entirely by the polish on the silver and the absence of any visible stains, whether those stains were financial or physical. Silas turned to his mother, his voice a jagged rasp in the quiet of the room. He demanded to know where the records had been moved, insisting that he needed to verify the interest rates before the Duke of Sterling arrived to settle the Sterling accounts. The Baroness did not flinch. She merely adjusted a stray porcelain figurine on the mantelpiece. Beatrice looked at the locked door of the library as if she could see through the stone walls all the way to the east wing. She reminded her son that as long as the Duke was in the house, Elara would remain invisible, a secret buried behind oak and iron. But the ledger, she insisted, must be finished. They were spending the house's heir as if it were infinite, unaware that the woman they had entombed in the shadows was the only one keeping the lungs of Blackwood Manor from collapsing entirely. The Baroness turned to leave, her focus already shifting to the menu for the upcoming dinner, leaving Silas to pace the room like a caged animal, haunted by the very air of the corridor he dared not enter. The tray arrived shortly thereafter with a sound like a quiet apology. A dull thud against the wood that signaled the only human contact Elara Vance would receive for the next 12 hours. Martha Higgins did not speak at first, her presence marked only by the labored rhythm of her breathing and the scent of damp wool that always clung to her skirts during the relentless rains of the Derbyshire season. The East Wing was a mausoleum of forgotten things. Broken chairs with their stuffing spilling out like pale entrails and mirrors, so clouded with dust they looked like they suffered from cataracts. Elara did not look up from the Blackwood ledger immediately. Her fingers were stained with the indigo blood of her inkwell, a mark of her secret, scrupulous industry. Martha set the tray on the scarred mahogany desk, and the two women shared a moment of wordless understanding. For a long moment, the only sound in the cavernous room was the scratch-scratch of the quill finishing a calculation on the family's mounting interest rates. "The Duke comes tomorrow," Martha whispered, her voice a thin, frayed thread in the vast, cold space, Elara's hand still, the nib of her pen hovering just above a column of figures that predicted the estate's total insolvency within the year. The name Julian Sterling carried a weight that seemed to press the very air from her lungs. In the local lore of the county, he was a man of granite and grey eyes, a sorrow wearing a man's coat who had not smiled in 7 years. He was the creditor who held the fate of Blackwood Manor in his calloused, aristocratic hands, a man who valued truth and efficiency over the decorative lies of the ton. He comes to settle the debt of the late Marquis. The Baroness is in a state, Elara. She is ordering the silver polished until it bleeds, and Silas has retreated to the brandy decanter. They are terrified he will look too closely at the books. Martha moved closer, her weathered hand trembling as she lifted a corner of the dry, grey bread that sat beside a bowl of thin mutton broth. Tucked beneath the crust was a small, red apple, so vibrant and full of life that it seemed an affront to the pervasive greyness of the wing. It was a tiny act of rebellion, a piece of fruit likely purloined from the lavish welcome baskets being prepared for the Duke's arrival, and the sight of it made Elara's throat tighten with a grief she had spent years mastering. She did not weep for the locked door or the social burial her mother had enforced. She wept for the sweetness of an apple she did not deserve. In 7 years, Martha was the only soul who had looked at Elara and seen a woman instead of a misfortune. The elderly servant squeezed Elara's shoulder, a forbidden, dangerous touch between a domestic and the invisible daughter, and then she was gone. The heavy latch clicked back into its socket with the finality of a gavel, leaving Elara alone with the ledger and the scent of fresh fruit that smelled of a world she was no longer permitted to inhabit. The silence returned, but it was soon interrupted by a sharper, more clinical sound that signaled the approach of the house's true architect of misery. The rustle of a high-priced silk pelisse heralded the arrival of Baroness Beatrice Vance. She did not open the door. She never did, for to Beatrice, the threshold of the abandoned suite was a boundary between the respectable world of the living and the shame she had spent years interring. Instead, the presence of the Baroness was announced by a rhythmic metallic tapping that echoed through the oak panels. Tink, tink, tink. The frigid metal instrument tapped against the door with the precision of a ticking clock. It was a sound Elara had learned to fear more than the dark or the cold. It was the psychological pulse of her containment, a constant reminder of exactly who held the power over her very breath. "Listen to me, Elara," Beatrice said, her voice cold and hard like a frozen pond. "The Duke of Sterling is not a man to be trifled with. He possesses the eyes of a hawk and a constitution that does not tolerate the slightest impropriety. If you make so much as a sound, if a floorboard creaks beneath your weight or a candle flickers too brightly in this wing, I will not merely keep you here. I will have you sent to the sanitarium on the moors. Do you understand? They have rooms there where the walls are padded to muffle the screams, and the light of day never enters. I will tell the world the grief of your condition. Finally broke your mind, and not a soul will doubt me." Elara stared at the locked door, her spine as straight as the columns of arithmetic she had mastered to keep this family from the poorhouse. She knew the threat was not hollow. To her mother, Elara was not a daughter, but a ledger entry that refused to balance. Her face, with its silvery line of history trailing toward her jaw, was a stain that threatened Silas's inheritance and the Baroness's tenuous grasp on social standing. She was the secret debt the Vances could never pay, and they hated her for the solvency she provided in secret. "I understand, Mother," Elara whispered, though the word mother felt like ash and bile in her mouth. Beatrice did not answer with a word of comfort or even a sigh of regret. There's only the sharp, retreating click of her heels on the stone corridor, leaving Elara to wonder if the Duke, who was coming to collect their debts, would be the one to finally realize that the most valuable thing in Blackwood Manor was the woman they had spent 7 years trying to erase. In the growing shadows of the isolated corridor, the estate appeared frozen in anticipation, waiting for a key that would do more than just lock a door. Julian Sterling's carriage arrived not with fanfare, but with a heavy, grinding finality that seemed to press the damp gravel of Blackwood Manor into submission. The sky above was the color of a bruised plum, a restless, unsettled gray that mirrored the Duke's own eyes. He sat within the velvet-lined shadows of the coach, his hands resting motionless upon his knees. He had worn his grief like weather for 7 years, and today the climate was cold. When the door was opened by a footman whose livery was a shade too frayed at the cuffs, Julian did not immediately move. He surveyed the house through the aperture of the door. It was an edifice that had once known dignity, yet now it appeared to be bracing itself against a collapse that only the ledgers could predict. Baroness Beatrice stood upon the portico, her silk gown of vibrant, aggressive yellow that clashed violently with the somber stone of the manor. She was all smiles and fluttering lace, a performance of prosperity that Julian found utterly exhausting. As he stepped onto the drive, the smell of damp rot and neglected boxwood reached him before the voice of his hostess did. The gardens were a disaster of overgrown briars and choked fountains, a physical manifestation of a family that had lost its way. Yet, when the Baroness ushered him into the drawing room and presented the preliminary summary of the estate's pecuniary health, the numbers told a different story. They were clean. They were scrupulous. They were quite frankly impossible, given the state of the roof and the weeds in the drive. "Our affairs are in excellent order, Your Grace," Beatrice chirped, her voice like the sound of breaking glass against a marble floor. "My son, Silas, has a most remarkable mind for the mathematics of the land. We are merely seeking a temporary bridge to finalize our winter yields, a mere formality between families of our standing." Julian did not answer. He remained standing, his tall frame casting a long, unyielding shadow across the faded Persian rug. Most notably, he did not remove his gloves. He kept the dark leather buckskin pulled tight over his fingers, a silent declaration that he did not intend to touch anything in this house longer than was strictly necessary. The atmosphere was stale, perfumed with an excess of lavender to mask the underlying scent of debt and desperation. He looked down at the sterling seal upon his own signet ring, then at the ledger pages Beatrice had laid out. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and possessed a rhythmic certainty that did not match the erratic, desperate energy of the woman before him. There was a soul behind these numbers, a mind that understood the poetry of a balanced account, but it was not the soul of the Baroness, nor was it the profligate Silas, whom Julian had glimpsed in the London gaming dens. He felt a flicker of curiosity, a rare spark in the granite of his mind. A ledger is the one honest room in the world, and someone in this house was telling the truth in ink, while everyone else lied in speech. He found the discrepancy between the polished arithmetic and the crumbling architecture of the manor to be a fascinating, if grotesque, riddle. High above the drawing room, where the air grew thin and the dust motes danced in the pale shafts of light, Elara Vance sat perfectly still. She was not looking at the Blackwood ledger, though it lay open before her, like an honest friend. Instead, she had her head tilted, her ear pressed near the floorboards where the wood was thinnest. The secluded flank was a mausoleum of silence, but today that silence had teeth. It bit at her with the sounds drifting from below. the sharp, shrill notes of her mother's vanity and the heavy, rhythmic thud of a stranger's stride. She did not need to see Julian Sterling to know him. She had been calculating his arrival for months, tracking the interest on the Sterling debts with the same precision a navigator uses to chart the stars. From the vibrations through the joists, she could tell he was a man of significant weight, not of flesh, but of presence. He moved with a deliberate, slow-burn energy that suggested a heart made of stone. Silas always scurried, his steps shallow and uneven. The Duke planted his feet, as if he owned the earth beneath them. She began to sketch a mental profile of him in the margins of her mind, matching the cadence of his low, resonant voice to the hard, unyielding figures she had recorded in the Sterling accounts. He was a man who spoke little, which meant he observed much. Elara felt a sudden, sharp pang of intellectual recognition. She imagined him looking at the figures she had prepared, those secret columns of truth she had slipped into the Baroness's folders to ensure the estate survived another winter. Would he see the corrections she had made to the grain tax? Would he realize that the house was solvent only because a ghost had been? The Sterling seal, she knew, represented a debt of honor that Silas had nearly destroyed. But as she listened to the vibrations of the Duke's voice, a sound that hummed like a distant storm, she realized that he was not there merely to collect. He was there to audit the truth of the house. He was a sorrow wearing a man's coat, and like her, he seemed to be searching for something that was not a facade. She closed her eyes, visualizing the silvery scar that trailed down her jaw, and wondered if a man who valued the honesty of a ledger might also find the worth in a face that the world had judged before looking. By the time the sun rose, the silence in her room felt less like a prison and more like a bridge. The morning room at Blackwood Manor was a study in faded grandeur, where the pale light of Tuesday did little to warm the damp slate of the hearth. Julian Sterling sat with a stillness that was constitutional, his grey eyes fixed upon the papers, spread across the mahogany table, with the intensity of a general surveying a map of certain defeat. Before him lay the Sterling seal, a heavy, cold weight of gold and sapphire that seemed to anchor the very air of the room. Across the table, Baroness Beatrice Vance adjusted her lace cuffs, her movements sharp and agitated. The silence between them was thick with the smell of old dust and the bitter scent of oversteeped tea. Julian did not look up when he finally spoke, his voice a low, even rasp. He noted that the interest rates listed for the mortgage on the northern tenancies were set at 7%, yet the Sterling bank records he had memorized with scrupulous care, clearly indicated a negotiated rate of 4%. He asked the Baroness to explain the discrepancy of 3%, a sum that, over the course of 7 years, amounted to a small fortune. Beatrice Vance stiffened, her spine becoming a rigid line of defensive propriety. She began to speak of administrative oversights and the complexities of rural land management, her words tumbling over one another in a frantic attempt to fill the void. Julian, however, did not interrupt. He simply looked at her, his expression as unreadable as a granite cliff. When she reached the end of her first explanation, he did not offer a rebuttal. Instead, he waited. He counted 10 full seconds in the hollow space of the room, watching as the ticking of the long case clock in the hall seemed to grow louder with every heartbeat. The silence possessed a weight that forced the Baroness into a nervous ramble. She began to speak of Silas and his tireless efforts to modernize the estate, of the rising costs of grain and the unforgiving nature of the recent winters. Every word she uttered was a brick in a wall of deception that Julian was dismantling without saying a syllable. He watched the way her hand trembled as she reached for her teacup, the fine china rattling against the saucer with a sound like a distant alarm. He knew then that the arithmetic of Blackwood was not merely flawed. It was a deliberate architecture of theft. Eventually, the Baroness ran out of excuses, her voice trailing off into a thin, ragged whisper. Julian finally shifted his gaze, his eyes meeting hers with a cold, terrifying clarity. He remarked that numbers were the one honest room in a world of lies, and at present the room she had built was collapsing. He did not accuse her of fraud. Not yet, but the implication hung in the air like the static before a summer storm. The Sterling seal caught a stray beam of light, flashing a brilliant, accusing blue against the dark wood. As the tension reached a point that felt nearly physical, Beatrice Vance shifted her tactics with the practiced ease of a stage actress. She lowered her head, the plume of her hat trembling, and reached into her sleeve for a handkerchief of fine Belgian lace. The transition from indignant landowner to grieving mother was seamless, yet to Julian's eyes, it was utterly transparent. She began to speak of the heavy burden she carried, of the secret shame that haunted the isolated block and drained the family's spirit as surely as any debt. She spoke of Elara, though she did not use the name, referring to her only as the unfortunate shadow of the house. She described a condition so severe, a visage so distorted by a curse of the bloodline, that the girl had to be kept from the sight of decent society for the sake of her own dignity. Beatrice claimed that the costs of her daughter's spiritual care and the constant vigilance required to keep her safe were the true source of their financial strain. It was a tragedy of the flesh, she whispered, a grotesque inheritance that no amount of gold could truly fix. Julian watched as a single, perfectly timed tear escaped the corner of the Baroness's eye and traced a path through the powder on her cheek. It was a masterclass in theatrical manipulation, designed to appeal to his sense of aristocratic gallantry and silence any further inquiry into the ledgers. However, Julian Sterling had endured his melancholy like a prolonged winter for 7 years, and he recognized the difference between a soul that was breaking and a heart that was merely performing. The tear did not move him. It only sharpened his suspicion. He observed that the Baroness spoke of her daughter as if she were a ghost already buried, a stain to be scrubbed from the family's reputation rather than a living woman. He found it curious, he noted dryly, that a medical condition of such gravity required no physician's visits in the household accounts, yet necessitated the permanent locking of the wing. Beatrice flinched at the mention of the lock, her hand instinctively flying to the heavy silver skeleton key that hung at her waist, partially hidden by the folds of her silk skirts. The Baroness recovered quickly, her voice taking on a tone of martyred patience. She insisted that Julian could not possibly understand the delicate nature of their propriety, or the depths of a mother's desire to shield her child from cruel judgment. Julian remained unmoved, his mind already moving past her words to the rhythmic scratching of the quill he had heard through the floorboards. He knew the sound of a person who was calculating, not one who was crumbling. He looked at the sterling seal once more, thinking of the integrity it represented, and then back at the woman who used her own daughter as a shield for her son's profligacy. The manor remained paralyzed in tension, and Julian Sterling realized that the truth of Blackwood was hidden behind the sturdy timber frame that Beatrice Vance guarded with such desperate ferocity. He stood up slowly, the movement bringing an end to the interview, but as he left, his gaze remained fixed on the ceiling above. In that shadowed upper reach of the sequestered wing, the silence had developed a peculiar weight, a density that felt like the presence of a predator. It nibbled at the edges of Elara Vance's resolve until only the cold, hard logic of arithmetic remained. She sat at the small, scarred writing desk, the only piece of furniture in the room that did not seem to be actively decomposing. Beneath her hands, the Blackwood ledger was a sanctuary of absolute order, the only honest record in a house built on a foundation of elegant deceits. The ink on her fingers was a permanent mark of her invisible governance, a dark stain that refused to be scrubbed away. Elara leaned closer to the guttering candle, her eyes tracing the erratic, looping script of her brother's recent entries. He was logging sales that Elara knew had never occurred, for the wood had not been purchased and the labor had not been hired. He was hemorrhaging the family's remaining credit into the pockets of London tailors and gaming houses, and he was doing so by forging the interest payments on the sterling debt. A soft, rhythmic scraping at the door signaled the arrival of Martha Higgins. The sound was the only clock Elara trusted, marking the passage of the evening with the delivery of a tray that smelled of cold mutton and the faint, earthy scent of the gardens. When the thick timber barrier creaked open, the fateful key remained firmly in Baroness Beatrice's possession, but the small service hatch, long since forgotten by the mistress of the house, allowed the two women a moment of whispered rebellion. "He is in the library, Miss Elara," Martha breathed, her voice barely a ripple in the stagnant air of the corridor. "The Duke, he sits there like a statue of grey stone, and the Baroness is playing the harp until her fingers must surely ache." She is telling him that you are too fragile of mind to receive guests, that the fire took more than just your skin. Elara's spine straightened, a movement as sharp and precise as a compass needle. She tells him what she must to keep the door locked, Martha. But the Duke did not come here for music or for the company of a delicate invalid. He came for his money, and if he believes the lies Silas has written in the official report, he will foreclose on Blackwood before the frost breaks. She reached for a fresh sheet of vellum, her movements scrupulous and deliberate. There was a certain beauty in a perfectly balanced column of figures, a morality that transcended the vanity of the ballroom. She began to write, her quill scratching a rhythmic scratch-scratch against the paper that sounded like the pulse of the house itself. She did not use the flowery, useless adjectives favored by her mother. She used the cold, hard verbs of the counting house: principal, interest, amortization. When the page was finished, it was a masterpiece of clarity, a razor-sharp audit of the Sterling loan that exposed the exact discrepancy Silas had attempted to hide. Elara looked at the document, her reflection in the cracked mirror on the wall, showing only the silvered trail of the scar along her jaw. A mark she no longer viewed as a curse, but as a badge of survival. She plucked a single strand of her own chestnut hair, winding it carefully around the folded vellum and securing the ends with a tiny, inconspicuous dab of black wax. Place this on the Duke's desk in the morning. Martha, Elara commanded, her voice holding the authority of a woman who had spent 7 years mastering the architecture of a crumbling estate. Put it beneath his correspondence. He is a man who notices the details. If he sees the hair, he will know it was not meant for the eyes of the Baroness. He will know someone in this mausoleum is still breathing. Downstairs, the atmosphere of Blackwood Manor was a carefully constructed facade of prosperity, held together by the heavy, artificial scent of lilies and the suffocating warmth of too many hearths. Julian Sterling sat in the high-backed mahogany chair of the library, his grey eyes fixed on the fire, with the stillness of a gentleman who had wrapped himself in sorrow for 7 years. To the casual observer, he was merely a sorrow wearing a man's coat, but beneath the stoic exterior, his mind was a ledger of its own, calculating the hollow ring of the Baroness's laughter and the nervous sweat on Silas Vance's brow. The accounts they had presented him earlier that evening were a mess of vanity and obfuscation. They smelled of Beatrice's cloying perfume, a scent designed to mask the rot of the floorboards and the insolvency of the family name. Julian loathed the artifice of it. He had spent his life in pursuit of the undeniable truth, whether in the ledgers of his duchy or on the battlefields of the peninsula. The Vances were offering him a performance, not a payment. The dawn arrived the following morning, in shades of bruised purple and cold slate. Julian was at his desk before the first servant had stirred the kitchen fires. He began to sort through the stack of morning papers, his movements efficient and drained of emotion. He moved aside a letter from his solicitor and a bill of lading for a shipment of grain, and then his fingers brushed against something that did not belong. It was a single sheet of vellum, tucked discreetly between 2 formal invitations. Unlike the heavy, cream-colored stationery the Baroness used to issue her commands, this paper was thin, worn, and smelled of something Julian had almost forgotten existed in this house: honesty. It bore the scent of dried lavender and the sharp, metallic tang of old ink. As he lifted the page, he felt a minute, nearly imperceptible resistance. He looked closer, his breath hitching in his chest. A single, fine strand of hair was bound around the paper, a secret seal that spoke of a desperate, quiet intimacy. It was not the golden thread of a coquette or the grey wire of a matron. It was the dark, defiant strand of someone who had been watching from the shadows. Julian broke the seal, the hair falling onto the dark desk, and unfolded the vellum. His eyes scanned the precise, elegant handwriting, tracing the columns of arithmetic that laid bare the precise nature of the Vance family's fraud. It was a flawless audit, signed not with a name, but with a black, thumb-pressed seal of ink at the bottom. He sat back, the silence of the library suddenly feeling different. It no longer had the teeth of a predator, but the expectant hush of a sanctuary. He looked at the page again, recognizing for the first time that Blackwood Manor was not a dead thing. Somewhere, behind a locked door, there was a mind that matched his own, a person who did not look at him and see a title, but a man who deserved the truth. In a profound departure from the last 7 years, the granite of Julian's heart felt the faint, terrifying warmth of a thaw. He looked toward the ceiling, sensing the scratch of that phantom pen, before descending once more to confront the living lies downstairs. The afternoon sun, pale and thin like a worn shilling, struggled to penetrate the heavy velvet curtains of the morning room where Julian now waited. He sat with a stillness that bordered on the statuesque, his grey eyes tracking the frantic, fluttering movements of Baroness Beatrice. She was a woman composed of nerves and sharp angles, her conversation a relentless stream of social trivialities that served as a poor veil for her mounting desperation. Julian found the performance tedious. He had not traveled to the damp edges of the county to be entertained by gossip. He was there for a reckoning. As a footman moved to refresh the tea service, Julian calculated the weight of the woman's distraction, noticing how her gaze flickered toward the silk folds of her bodice. As the footman reached for the porcelain pot, the Duke's hand brushed the tray with a choreographed clumsiness. The hot amber liquid splashed across the polished mahogany table, narrowly missing the Baroness's skirts. Beatrice gasped, her composure shattering like dropped crystal. In that singular moment of unvarnished panic, she did not reach for her handkerchief or her fan. Her hand flew instantly to her chest, her fingers curling protectively over the hidden shape of the silver skeleton key. The metal must have been cold against her skin, a physical anchor for her secrets. Julian watched the way her knuckles whitened, the sheer possessive terror in her eyes revealing more than a ledger ever could. "My apologies, Baroness," Julian said, his voice a low, rhythmic rumble that carried no genuine remorse. "It seems my hand is as unsteady as the accounts of this house." He produced a linen square, dabbing at the spill with a slow, measured precision that forced her to remain close, to endure his scrutiny. He saw the pulse throbbing at her throat, a trapped bird beneath the skin. She had the key to a door she claimed did not exist, and Julian knew then that the rot she spoke of was not in the wood or the stone, but in the very air she breathed. Beatrice laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and tried to tuck the secret deeper into her stays. "It is of no consequence, Your Grace. The servants are quite used to Silas's exuberance. A little tea is nothing compared to the daily trials of maintaining an estate of this magnitude." She was lying with the practiced ease of a woman who had turned deception into a domestic art. Julian leaned back, his eyes never leaving her face. The structure seemed to be steeped in a breathless silence around them, the silence in the corridors possessing teeth that nipped at the edges of his patience. The heavy atmosphere of the study shifted when Silas Vance entered. His face flushed with the false bravado of a scoundrel who had spent his morning at the bottom of a brandy decanter. He offered a greeting that was far too loud for the small room, his eyes darting toward the Duke with a mixture of greed and ancestral pride. Julian did not rise. He reached into his coat and produced a folded parchment, the paper crisp and unforgiving. He laid it upon the table, the Sterling family crest, a falcon in flight, staring up at the room with a cold, judgmental eye. "You speak often of the debt your late father owed the Sterling line," Julian began, his words clipped and heavy with the weight of granite. "But I did not come to Blackwood for a simple collection. I came because of this." He unfolded the document, revealing a Sterling bank draft for a sum that would have bought 3 such estates. At the bottom, the signature was a masterpiece of mimicry, a flowery script that intended to represent the Duke's own hand. "A forgery, Silas. A clumsy theft attempted against a house that keeps its records in iron and ink." Silas blanched, the color draining from his cheeks until he resembled the dust motes dancing in the failing light. "Your Grace, there must be a misunderstanding. A clerical error of the highest order." He reached for the paper, but Julian's hand was faster, pinning the forgery to the mahogany with a strength that made the wood groan. The Duke then reached into his waistcoat and pulled forth the Sterling seal, the heavy gold ring catching the light with a predatory glint. It was a symbol of authority that had not changed in 4 generations. With a deliberateness that felt like a sentence being passed, Julian pressed the signet ring into a fresh pool of red wax on a nearby blotter. He then lifted the forged document and compared the wax impression already on the paper to the one he had just made. They were identical. The forgery had been sealed with a stolen or replicated stamp, one that could only have been handled by someone within the inner sanctum of Blackwood. "Numbers do not lie," Julian murmured, his voice a cold wind. "People lie about them, and this seal has never left my family's sight. Until 7 years ago." The realization hit the room like a physical blow. Silas began to stammer, his hands trembling as he reached for a chair to steady himself. He looked at his mother, searching for a lie that would hold. But the Baroness was staring at the Duke with a horrified fascination. The Sterling seal was more than a trinket. It was a weapon of legal destruction. Julian watched them both, his observation scrupulous and unforgiving. He saw the way they both avoided looking toward the east wing, as if the very direction held the ghost of their undoing. He turned his gaze toward the door that led to the silent, shadowed wing of the house. Somewhere behind those locked doors, a quill was scratching against paper, a rhythmic sound of competence that mocked the chaos of the main hall. Julian felt a strange, thawing hope in his chest, a sensation he had thought buried under the frost of his own losses. He would have that key. He would open the door that the Vances had spent years trying to weld shut with shame and silence. The architecture of this family's soul was crumbling, and Julian Sterling was prepared to watch the facade fall, starting with the secrets of that dark annex. While Julian paced below, the candle on the scarred oak table in the upper room had burned down to a stubborn nub. In the corner of the small airless bedchamber, Elara Vance stood before a mirror that was less a looking-glass and more a collection of silvered shards. It was a cruel object, one that the Baroness Beatrice had surely chosen for its ability to distort whatever it captured, a visual punishment to match her physical exile. For years, the glass had served as a reminder of Elara's supposed inadequacy, but tonight the shadows it cast felt different. They were no longer a shroud, but a veil she was finally prepared to lift. She reached out an ink-stained finger and traced the silvery line of the scar on her jaw. It was pale, almost luminous, winding like a river of silver from her temple down to her neck. The kitchen maids used to whisper that she had caught a kiss from the moon, but Beatrice had spent 7 years, describing it as a stain upon the Vance lineage, a biological error that necessitated her removal from the sight of respectable society. Elara leaned closer, her breath fogging the cold glass. She did not look at the mark with the revulsion that had been demanded of her. Instead, she viewed it with the same scrupulous detachment she applied to a complex column of figures. It was merely a variable in the equation of her life, a constant that defined her perimeter but did not dictate her value. The silence of the barricaded hall was not an empty thing. It was a weight that pressed against the eardrums, a silence that seemed, as Martha Higgins often whispered, to have teeth. It was the sound of a house clenching its teeth, waiting for a collapse that only Elara's hidden arithmetic prevented. She looked at the reflection of her eyes, which remained clear and sharp despite the dim light. There was a resilience in the architecture of her own face that she had never been permitted to acknowledge. The Baroness might possess the master key, but she did not possess the truth of what lay behind the locked door. Elara was not a ghost, and she was certainly not a curse. She was the one honest soul in a house built on the shifting sands of debt and deception, and as she touched the cool surface of the mirror, she realized that the Duke's presence in the manor had acted as a catalyst, turning her isolation into a fortress of observation. Outside the formidable wooden door, the corridor was a mausoleum of velvet and dust. Julian Sterling moved through the shadows with the predatory stillness of a hunter who had long since mastered the art of listening. He did not carry a lamp. He had spent 7 years negating the dark landscapes of his own grief, and his eyes had grown accustomed to the absence of light. He had left the stifling atmosphere of the drawing room, where the Baroness Beatrice's laughter had sounded like the shattering of glass, and where Silas Vance had spent the evening attempting to project an intelligence he did not possess. Julian had sensed the lie the moment he crossed the threshold of Blackwood Manor. The accounts were too perfect, the ledgers too precise for a man of Silas's profligate reputation. There was a mind at work in this house that was being suppressed, a voice that was being strangled by propriety. He reached the end of the gallery, where the air grew colder and the scent of damp slate replaced the smell of expensive beeswax. Here, the east wing began. He stood perfectly still, his tall frame a silhouette of granite against the graying wallpaper. And then he heard it. It was a sound so faint that a lesser man would have dismissed it as the scurrying of mice. The rhythmic, purposeful scratch of a quill against parchment. It was the sound of labor, of calculation, of a mind refusing to be idle. Julian approached the door, his gaze fixed on the heavy wood that separated him from the mystery. He did not try the handle. He knew the Baroness kept the key tucked into the folds of her gown. He simply stood there, feeling the vibration of the person on the other side. He did not ask who was there. Such a question would have invited a lie or a frightened silence. Instead, Julian spoke in a voice that was low and resonant, a tone that carried the weight of a man who valued truth above all else. He quoted the opening lines of a difficult philosophical theorem regarding the stability of irregular structures, a text that few in England had the education to recognize, let alone understand. The equilibrium of the whole, he whispered to the wood, is not found in the perfection of the parts, but in the scrupulous balance of the friction between them. He paused, his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. He was not looking for a servant or a ghost. He was looking for the architect of the Blackwood ledger. The scratching of the pen stopped abruptly. For a moment, the silence between them was so absolute that it felt as though the very air had turned to stone. Then, from the opposite side of the door, a woman's voice emerged. It was not the trembling whisper of a broken captive, but a clear, precise tone that carried the self-assurance of a scholar. "The friction," she replied, her voice slipping through the keyhole like a secret, "is only sustainable if the foundation itself remains unbroken. Otherwise, the structure does not stand. It merely waits to fall." Julian closed his eyes, a strange, thawing heat spreading through his chest. For 7 years he had worn his grief like weather. But in that moment, in the cold hallway of a crumbling house, he felt the first stirrings of a recognition that had nothing to do with rank. He had found the mind that was saving Blackwood, and he knew that the face hidden behind that door was the only one in the world he truly wished to see. He leaned his forehead against the oak, the sterling seal on his finger catching a stray glint of moonlight, and promised the silence that he would be the one to open the door. But first, he would have to endure the theatre of the evening meal. The dining room at Blackwood Manor was a masterclass in the architecture of deception, a stage where the furniture was grander than the souls of the people who sat upon it. Baroness Beatrice had ordered the finest beeswax tapers to be lit, their golden glow struggling to illuminate the heavy, dust-prone velvet hangings. The scent of roasted venison and spiced wine hung thick in the air, an olfactory shield intended to mask the persistent smell of damp rot that emanated from the bones of the house. Julian Sterling sat at the long mahogany table, his grey eyes observing the frantic hospitality of his hostess, with a silence that was itself a form of judgment. "You must forgive the draught." "Your Grace," Beatrice simpered, gesturing delicately toward the shadowed hallway that led away from the warmth of the hearth. "The older sections of the house are quite prone to the cold. We intend to seal them off completely before winter. The rot has taken hold of the joists and the vermin. Well, one simply cannot guarantee the safety of any guest who wanders too far in that direction. We keep it locked for the sake of propriety and the health of the household. It is a mausoleum of better days." Julian did not answer immediately. He picked up his silver fork, noting the fine, dark patina of neglect that clung to the tines in spite of the frantic polishing they had clearly received that afternoon. It was not the noble tarnishing of age, but the result of a household where the servants had long since lost their pride, or perhaps their wages. He looked at Silas Vance, who was currently occupied in draining a third glass of claret with a desperation that spoke of a hollowed-out soul. Silas had the look of a man who was running out of shadows to hide in, his eyes darting toward the Duke whenever the conversation turned toward the estate's management. The rot Beatrice spoke of was not confined to the timber of the wing. It was here, in the main hall, evidenced by the uneven weave of the tablecloth and the way the footmen moved with a sluggish, unobserved insolence. Julian realized then that Blackwood Manor was a ledger that no longer balanced. The family was insolvent, not merely in coin but in character. They had locked away their truth in the darkness, thinking that a heavy door and a silver key could prevent the inevitable audit of their lives. The silence that followed the Baroness's proclamation was heavy. It seemed in that moment to have teeth. "I find," Julian finally murmured, his voice low and level like the grinding of stone against stone. That rot is often a matter of perspective. One can repair timber with enough care, one can excise vermin with enough diligence, but a house that has forgotten how to speak its own truth is a far more dangerous habitation. Do you not agree, Baroness? A ledger is the one honest room in the world, and yet your accounts seem to suggest a house that is suffocating in its own silence. Beatrice stiffened, her painted smile freezing into a mask of polite terror. She had expected a duke who would be easily distracted by flattery and the weight of a title. She had not calculated for a man who measured the world in the cold arithmetic of integrity. She reached for her wine, her hand trembling so violently that the red liquid slopped against the side of the crystal glass. A crimson stain on the white linen, a debt that could not be wiped away. Later that night, when the house had settled into its habitual, stifled breathing, Julian Sterling climbed the narrow, neglected stairs to the upper level. He did not carry a candle. He moved through the shadows with the practiced ease of a soldier who had long ago made a truce with the dark. The corridor was a landscape of cold slate and forgotten echoes, the air growing sharper and more honest as he moved away from the perfumed lies of the main house. As he reached the heavy door that held Elara Vance in her silent exile, he paused. He could hear it then, the faint, rhythmic scratch of a quill from within. It was a scrupulous, persistent sound, the labor of a mind refusing to be extinguished by the weight of a locked door. It was the sound of competence in a house of waste. Julian reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew the sterling seal. It was a heavy thing, cast in solid gold and etched with the crest of his house. A signet that signified his presence, his word, and a protection that no baroness could countermand. He knelt, a gesture of profound humility that would have scandalized the London ton, and placed the seal on the floorboards directly in front of the threshold. It was a silent declaration of war against the silence of the house. It was a signal that the darkness had an end. He waited, his own breath matching the rhythm of the quill on the other side of the wood. Inside the room, Elara Vance froze. She had heard the heavy, deliberate footfalls, so different from the sharp, clipping gait of Beatrice or the stumbling, drunken thuds of Silas. This presence smelled of the outdoors, of rain, of leather, and of a strange, terrifying safety. She looked down at the gap beneath the door and saw the sliver of gold gleaming in the meager candlelight. She knew what it represented. It was the weight of a man who looked at the world and saw only facts. Elara did not have a signet. She did not have a name that was allowed to be spoken in the light. She looked at her hands, where the ink of the Blackwood ledger had stained her fingers a permanent, scholarly grey, the badge of her quiet, 7-year war. She took a small scrap of parchment, a corner torn from a page of interest calculations, and pressed her thumb firmly against the wet ink remaining in her well. With a hand that did not shake, she slid the scrap of paper under the door. It was her answer to the Duke. A thumbprint, the mark of her identity, her labor, and her existence, offered in the dark to the only man who had bothered to listen for the scratching of her pen. Being seen by the right person was not the danger. It was the only safety worth the name. Beyond the thick wooden panels, she heard the faint, metallic scrape of the seal being retrieved, and then the sound of retreating footsteps that promised to return. The hallway of the upper floor was a throat choked with the dust of decades, a place where the air itself felt heavy with the weight of things unsaid. Midnight had long since claimed Blackwood Manor, and the house was holding its breath, as though the very stones awaited a collapse that had been centuries in the making. Within the confines of her locked chamber, Elara Vance sat as she always did, her spine a straight line of defiance against the encroaching shadows. The tallow candle on her desk flickered, casting a dancing, sickly light over the open pages of the Blackwood ledger. It was a massive volume, bound in leather that felt like cold, dead skin, and within its scrupulous columns, Elara had recorded the slow, agonizing death of her family's honor. The scratch of her quill was the only pulse in the room until the floorboards in the corridor groaned under a weight that was neither silent nor subtle. Elara froze, her ink-stained fingers tightening around the feather. This was not the light, rhythmic step of Martha Higgins, nor was it the heavy, weather-beaten stride of Julian Sterling, which she had come to recognize through the thinness of the floorboards. This was a frantic, uneven gait, the sound of a man fleeing his own shadow. A key rattled in the lock, but it was the wrong key, scraping uselessly against the iron plate. Then came the thud of a shoulder against the wood, a desperate, blunt force that made the hinges scream in protest. Silas Vance was on the other side of that door, and the sound of his breathing was jagged, laced with the sharp edge of panic. He was no longer the arrogant heir who had sneered at her scar. He was a cornered animal realizing that the Duke's audit was a noose tightening around his neck. "Open the door, Elara," Silas hissed, his voice a distorted rasp through the heavy oak door. "I know it is in there. I know you have it. Give me the book, and perhaps I shall convince Mother to let you walk in the garden for an hour. Give it to me, you wretched creature, before I break this threshold apart." Elara did not answer. To speak was to acknowledge his power, and in this room, amidst the arithmetic of his ruin, she was the only sovereign. She looked down at the ledger, at the ink that detailed every forged signature and every embezzled pound Silas had squandered on the green tables of London. This book was her life's work, the only evidence that she existed at all in a world that sought to bury her. It was her shield, and now it would be her barricade. With a strength born of years of quiet labor, Elara stood and gathered the massive ledger into her arms. It was heavy, a physical manifestation of the Vance family's sins. She knelt by the door, where the lower latch had grown loose with age, and wedged the thatts, the thick leather spine of the book, into the narrow gap between the floor and the doorframe. She braced her shoulder against the wood, feeling the vibrations of Silas's blows. Each strike was a testament to his cowardice. He did not want the truth. He wanted the silence he thought he had purchased by locking her away. He threw his weight against the door again, the wood splintering near the lock, but the ledger held. The very documentation of his larceny was now the physical obstacle preventing him from committing one final theft. Elara closed her eyes, the silvery scar on her jaw, pressing against the cool grain of the oak. She was the payment for a debt she did not owe, but she would not be the one to pay it in the dark. The struggle in the hallway reached a fever pitch of muffled curses and frantic clawing, but then, quite suddenly, the violence ceased. It was replaced by a silence so absolute it felt as though the wind itself had died. The silence, it seemed, had teeth. Outside in the corridor, Silas Vance recoiled as though he had struck a wall of ice. Julian Sterling stood 3 paces away, his silhouette a jagged tear in the dim moonlight that filtered through the high, grime-streaked windows. The Duke had not made a sound in his approach. He moved with the predatory stillness of a man who had spent 7 years wearing his grief like weather. His grey eyes were not filled with anger, which Silas might have understood, but with a cold, analytical disgust that was far more devastating. Julian did not move to strike the man. He merely stood, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his posture a supreme act of social and moral dominance. He looked at Silas's disheveled cravat, at the sweat beading on his forehead, and then at the locked door of the exiled chamber. The sterling seal on his finger caught a stray glint of moonlight, a reminder of the authority Silas had tried so desperately to forge. "It is a curious thing, Mr. Vance," Julian said, his voice low and resonant, carrying the weight of a judge passing sentence. "To find the master of the house attempting to break into his own rooms in the dead of night. One wonders if the late Baron would recognize the gait of his heir, or if he would mistake it for that of a common thief." Silas stammered, his hands shaking as he tried to smooth his coat. "Your Grace, there is a matter of household security, a pestilence in this wing. I was merely ensuring that the rot had not spread." "The rot has indeed spread," Julian replied, his gaze never wavering from Silas's face. "But it did not begin in the wood or the stone. It began in the ledgers. And I suspect that what you seek is not a pestilence, but the cure." Julian took a single step forward, and Silas instinctively backed away, his spine hitting the opposite wall. The Duke was a man of profound restraint, but in that moment, the air around him seemed to vibrate with a suppressed indignation. He reached out, not to touch Silas, but to adjust the man's rumpled lapel with a flick of his fingers that was more insulting than a blow to the face. "You have spent the evening attempting to convince me of your sister's infirmity," Julian continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed like a threat. "You spoke of a face that would offend the light. But the only thing I find offensive in this house is the cowardice of a man who hides his debts behind a locked door." Julian turned his head slightly toward the door, his eyes softening for a fleeting second as he looked at the wood where Elara knelt just beyond the threshold. He could hear her even breathing, the steady rhythm of a woman holding her ground. Silas fled into the darkness of the main house, his footsteps receding like a fading heartbeat. Julian remained in the hallway, his shadow long and motionless. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from the door of the east wing. He did not knock, for he knew the impropriety of the hour, but he let his fingers brush the wood, a silent promise of the dawn that was to come. Behind the barricade, Elara felt the faint vibration of his touch, and for the first time since the fire, the house did not feel like a grave. It felt like a sanctuary that was finally, irrevocably, being seen by the light. By the following morning, the drawing room of Blackwood Manor felt smaller than it ever had, as if the walls were leaning in to witness the final collapse of a structural lie. Baroness Beatrice stood by the mahogany escritoire, her fingers twisting the lace of her cuffs with a frantic motion that betrayed her porcelain expression. Julian Sterling occupied the center of the rug like a monument carved from Derbyshire slate. His grey eyes were now sharp with a terrifying, scrupulous clarity. The silence in the room had teeth. It bit at the edges of the Baroness's composure until the air itself felt brittle. She offered a laugh, a sound like breaking glass that scattered uselessly against the heavy velvet drapes. "Your Grace, I assure you, that side of the house is quite uninhabitable. It is a place of illness and misfortune. My daughter is not fit for the eyes of a man of your standing. Her face is a penance we carry in private. To open that door is to invite a scandal that even the Sterling name cannot shield. Do not mistake my silence for a lack of discernment," Julian countered, stepping forward with a deliberate, heavy grace. "I have heard the scratching of a pen where you claim there is only decay. I have seen the corrections in a ledger that no man in this room possesses the intellectual grit to write. You have kept a mind in a cage, because you feared the imperfection of the flesh, and I find that I have a profound distaste for the imprisonment of a superior soul." The gathered servants, standing like shadows along the panelled walls, collectively held their breath. Silas Vance lurked in the corner, his face the color of spoiled cream, unable to find the courage to intervene as he watched his mother's authority crumble. Seeing the iron determination in the Duke's gaze, the Baroness's mask finally cracked. In a spasm of pure, vindictive panic, she reached into the hidden pocket of her silk skirt and withdrew the family's master key. For a heartbeat, she looked toward the open window, her arm tensing to hurl the silver instrument into the tangled, overgrown brambles of the moat below. A final act of erasure to keep her secret buried. She was not fast enough. Julian's hand shot out, catching her wrist with a speed that was neither violent nor hesitant, but absolute. It was the grip of a man who had mastered his own strength through years of cold, hard discipline. The silver key glinted in the candlelight, a mocking thing that had held Elara Vance in stasis for 7 years. Julian's fingers uncurled the Baroness's trembling hand with a terrifying gentleness, his touch as cold as the metal he reclaimed. "Vengeance is a poor architect, Baroness," Julian whispered, his voice cutting through her gasping breath. "It builds houses that eventually fall upon the builder. You have used this key to lock away the only honest thing in Blackwood. Now, you will watch as I use it to bring the truth into the light." He took the key, its metal biting into his palm, and turned his back on the wreckage of the Vance family's ossified propriety. The walk from the drawing room to the east wing was a journey through the lungs of a dying house. Julian felt the weight of every portrait on the walls, ancestors who had valued the symmetry of a face over the brilliance of a mind. The household followed at a distance, a silent, shuffling procession of the curious and the condemned. Martha Higgins was among them, her apron bunched in her hands, her eyes bright with a hope she had not dared to feed since the night of the fire. Julian did not look back. He watched the way the light changed as he crossed the threshold of the main gallery into the shadowed corridors, where the air grew thin and smelled of old paper. The east wing did not breathe like the rest of the house. It held its breath, suspended in a mercenary silence. As Julian approached the heavy oak door, he noticed the scuff marks on the floorboards where Silas had tried to force his way in, contrasted against the pristine, untouched dust of the upper panels. This was the boundary of a 7-year war, a wall built of shame and maintained by the silver skeleton key he now held. He felt the coldness of the stone floor beneath his boots and the heavy, rhythmic thud of his own heart. A heart that had been a sorrow wearing a man's coat for far too long, now suddenly spurred by a fierce, protective purpose. When he reached the door, he did not immediately thrust the key into the lock. He stopped. He stood before the wood, his shadow stretching long and dark against the grain, acknowledging the gravity of the barrier. Behind him the Baroness began a frantic, high-pitched explanation about the necessary protection of the family's dignity, but Julian silenced her with a single, backward glance that carried the weight of a death sentence. This was not a theater for her performative grief or her hollow excuses. He turned back to the door and rested his calloused palm against the wood, sensing the stillness on the other side. He was acutely aware that to simply burst in would be a second violation of the woman who lived within. To her family, she was a stain to be hidden. To the world, she might be a curiosity to be pitied. Julian wished otherwise. He waited in the absolute stillness of the corridor, the assassin's sign stretched, a taut, vibrating chord, until he heard a soft, rhythmic movement from within, the sound of someone standing up, of a spine straightening, and the unmistakable click of a ledger being closed for the final time. The house seemed to lean forward, the foundations trembling in anticipation of the moment the lock would finally yield. Julian fitted the antique implement into the keyhole, the cold metal meeting the mechanism with a sound that signaled the end of an era of shadows. The ornate forged key felt heavier in Julian Sterling's hand as he prepared to turn it. It was the weight of 7 years of isolation, of a woman's life compressed into the dimensions of a single wing. The lock was stubborn, rusted by the damp air and the cruelty of disuse, and for a heartbeat it resisted his authority. Behind him the corridor was crowded with the silent staff, and the pale-faced Baroness Beatrice, who looked as though she might collapse. Julian did not look back. He leaned his broad shoulder into the wood, his grey eyes fixed on the keyhole, and turned the metal with a deliberate, grinding force. The door yielded with a groan that sounded like a long-suppressed sigh, and sunlight sharp and unforgiving poured through the doorway. It streamed from the window behind her, slicing through the gloom of the forgotten quarters like a revelation in an age. In the center of that light stood Elara Vance. She did not recoil. She did not hide her face behind her hands as the Baroness had surely expected. Instead, she stood with her spine as straight as a ledger line, her ink-stained fingers resting atop a mountain of paper that covered every inch of a scarred mahogany desk. The manor remained perfectly still. And at long last, after 7 years, it felt as though the oxygen might finally return to the lungs of Blackwood Manor. Julian did not look at her jaw first. He did not seek out the flaw his host had described as a ruinous curse that would wither the senses of any who gazed upon it. His gaze was drawn instead to the calluses on her fingertips and the precise, scrupulous columns of figures laid out before her. The room was not a cell, though it had been intended as one. It was a fortress built of arithmetic. In the stale air, the smell of cheap tallow and old parchment was thick, a sensory testament to a mind that had refused to go dormant even in a cage. He saw the Blackwood ledger, open and bleeding with the red ink of family debt, and he understood in a single, silent moment that the woman before him was the only person in this house who had been telling the truth. She was the one honest room in a mansion built of lies. He walked toward her with the slow, measured pace of a man approaching a sacred site. The silence, it seemed, had teeth, but they were no longer sinking into Elara. They were turned now toward the woman in the doorway. Julian stopped a few paces from the desk, his presence filling the cramped, dusty space until the very shadows seemed to retreat into the corners. He looked at the ink on her thumb, then at the steady, unwavering light in her eyes. He had borne his pain like a bleak season for 7 years, and in this woman's quiet, competent gaze, he saw the first break in the clouds. He did not see a victim. He saw a master of her craft, an architect who had mapped the ruin of her own house while being buried beneath its stones. "Close the door, Your Grace. I beg of you." "Do not look upon her." Baroness Beatrice's voice pierced the stillness like breaking glass. She hovered at the threshold, her hands fluttering at her throat, her eyes wide with a performative horror that had served her well for 7 winters. She had spent years cultivating a myth of monstrosity to justify her own vanity, weaving a narrative that Elara's face was a stain upon the Vance name, a thing that would ruin the family's social standing and destroy Silas's prospects. Silas stood behind her, his face a mask of sweating cowardice, his eyes darting toward the ledgers that held the exact record of his embezzlement. The air in the corridor was thick with the scent of fear and expensive perfume, a cloying combination that made Julian's jaw tighten with a cold, simmering indignation. Julian moved closer to the desk, ignoring the hysterical pleas from the corridor. He reached out, his hand hovering near Elara's shoulder, not to touch, but to signify his protection. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, as she slowly turned her head toward the afternoon light. The silvery scar was there, trailing from her cheek toward her jaw, a thin, shimmering line that marked where the fire had kissed her years ago. It was not a horror. It was a map of survival, a mark of honesty in a house of masks. It did not distort her features. If anything, it lent her a dignity that the Baroness could never hope to possess. It was a mark of iron in a world of silk, a physical manifestation of the resilience that had kept her sane while her family tried to erase her. "There is nothing here to hide," Julian said, his voice level and hard as granite. He turned to face the Baroness, his silhouette tall and formidable against the light of the open door. The servants, gathered in the hallway, began to murmur, their curiosity finally outweighing the fear of their mistress. Martha Higgins pushed to the front of the crowd, her eyes wet with tears as she saw Elara standing in the sun. One by one, the staff caught a glimpse of the woman there. Beatrice shrieked, a sound of pure vanity being punctured by the needle of reality. "I am blinded," she cried, covering her eyes as if the sight of her daughter's face were a physical blow. But the servants did not look away. They looked at Elara, and then they looked at the Baroness. And the power dynamic of the house shifted irrevocably. The lies that had held the Vance family together were dissolving. Julian turned back to Elara, acknowledging her mind before her appearance, just as he had promised. Being seen by the right person was the only safety worth the name, and as he led her toward the drawing room to settle the final account, Elara Vance walked with the weight of her ledgers and the strength of the truth. The drawing room of Blackwood Manor had always been a stage for choreographed performances. But now the sunlight that Elara had craved for 7 years streamed through the high windows, like an interrogator's lamp. It illuminated the frayed edges of the family's dignity and the sheer desperation etched into her mother's features. Elara stood in the center of the room, her spine as unyielding as a ledger's margin. She did not seek to hide the silvery mark upon her jaw. In the presence of the numbers she had mastered, the mark was merely another honest fact. The Blackwood ledger rested in her hands, its leather cover worn smooth. Opposite her, Silas Vance paced by the cold hearth, his face the color of curdled cream. He acted as though she were a phantom returned from a shallow grave, not a woman of flesh and bone, but a personified debt. Baroness Beatrice sat on the edge of a mahogany chair, her hands clutching a lace handkerchief so tightly the threads threatened to snap under the strain. The silence in the room, it seemed, had teeth, biting into the arrogant certainty that had sustained the Vances while they squandered a fortune they did not truly possess. On the 14th of June, Elara began, her voice steady and devoid of the tremors Beatrice had likely expected from a prisoner. £300 were withdrawn for a purported stable renovation that never occurred. Instead, the funds were traced to a gaming house in St. James under a pseudonym Silas has used since his 2nd year at Oxford. She turned a page, the sound of the parchment sharp as a guillotine's strike. Silas flinched, his eyes darting toward the door, as if he might bolt into the afternoon mists. But Julian Sterling stood near the threshold, his broad shoulders blocking any hope of escape, his grey eyes fixed with terrifying focus on the woman who held the book. "Numbers do not lie," Elara continued, her tone clipped and scrupulous. "People lie about them, but the arithmetic remains a faithful witness." A ledger, she realized, was the only honest room in the world. She proceeded to read the systematic depletion of the estate's lifeblood with the cold precision of an auditor. She detailed the grain rents embezzled from the tenant farmers, the timber rights sold under forged signatures, and the disappearance of the very dowry that should have secured her own future, now vanished into the pockets of London tailors and card sharps. With every figure she recited, the air in the room grew thinner, the weight of her evidence pressing the Baroness further into the shadows of her finery. Beatrice attempted to rise, her voice a shrill imitation of her former authority. This is preposterous. A girl locked away for her own safety, a mind clearly addled by the vapors of isolation, cannot be trusted with such complex calculations. She gestured wildly toward the ledger, her rings catching the light. Julian did not move, but the temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He looked at the Baroness not with anger, but with the profound contempt one might show a debtor who had tried to pay a gold debt with leaden coins. The Blackwood ledger remained open in Elara's steady grip, a testament to a moral bankruptcy that no social standing could mask. "The total deficit," Elara said, closing the volume with a final heavy thud that echoed like a door shutting on a tomb, "exceeds the valuation of the estate's liquid assets by £4,000. You have not only squandered the Vance name, you have rendered this house insolvent." The silence that followed was absolute. Silas had stopped his pacing, his hands trembling as they rested on the mantelpiece. The mastery Elara had cultivated in the dark had become a weapon in the light, and for the first time in her life, she saw her family for what they truly were: small, frightened people who had forgotten that every debt eventually demands a full and honest accounting. Julian Sterling stepped away from the door, his boots echoing against the floorboards with the finality of a judge's gavel. He did not spare a glance for the ruin of Silas or the collapse of the Baroness. His world had narrowed to the woman who stood amongst the wreckage of her family's pride, still holding the instrument of their exposure. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal coat and produced a small, heavy object, the Sterling seal. The gold of the ring caught the filtered light, its intricate crest representing a lineage built on cold truth and the granite-like weight of a promise kept. "A house that cannot manage its own breath does not deserve to stand," Julian remarked, his voice low and resonant, carrying the ancient authority of his title. He looked at Silas, who had withered into a mere shadow of a gentleman. "You have treated your sister as a secret to be buried, yet it is her scrupulous mind that has kept the roof over your heads for 7 years. The debt I came to collect was financial, but the debt I find here is one of character. A deficit so vast that no amount of sterling gold could ever hope to fill it." He turned to Elara then, his expression softening into a look of profound recognition, a thawing of a winter that had lasted since his own heart had frozen. He placed a formal document on the mahogany desk, a legal transfer of the estate's stewardship. In the eyes of the law, the Vance inheritance was a tangled web of entailments and debts, but through the Sterling Bank's various acquisitions, Julian held the power to appoint a receiver. "I find the current management of Blackwood Manor to be insufficient," the Duke said with a dry, aristocratic wit that cut deeper than any insult. "I require a governor who understands the value of a single penny, as well as the weight of a human soul." He pressed the sterling seal into the pools of red wax at the bottom of the parchment, the click of the signet ring, signaling the end of the Baroness's reign. He then turned the document toward Elara, offering her the quill. "It requires a witness," he whispered, his eyes searching hers for the spark of the woman he had met through the scratching of a pen through a locked door, "and it requires a master." Elara looked at the space beside his seal. She possessed no ring, no crest of her own, that the world would recognize as a sign of power. Her fingers were still stained with the ink of her labor, the dark smudges a mark of the competence that had been her only companion in the East Wing. She looked at Julian, seeing in his grey eyes a safety that was not based on her face, but on the integrity of her mind. She did not reach for the pen. Instead, Elara pressed her ink-stained thumb firmly onto the paper beside the royal red of the Duke's seal. It was a smudge of common black ink against the formal wax. Julian stood tall beside her, his presence providing a shield that no amount of social venom could pierce. Elara Vance was no longer the girl in the shadows, hidden for a mark she had not chosen. She was the woman who had counted the cost of her own survival and found herself, in the final tally, remarkably solvent. Together, they looked toward the open door of the East Wing, which would never be locked against her again. The era of the silver skeleton key was over, and a new accounting had begun. The next morning arrived not as a herald of glory, but as a quiet auditor, stripping away the pretenses that had clung to Blackwood Manor for a generation. The air was sharp with the scent of damp slate and the dying embers of a night of calculations. At the foot of the grand staircase, the black carriage waited, its lacquer reflecting the pale light of a Derbyshire dawn. Baroness Beatrice Vance stood by the open vehicle door, her posture rigid, though the silk of her pelisse seemed to hang heavily, as if the weight of her stripped authority had physical mass. Beside her, Silas shifted restlessly, searching for a world that still recognized his name as currency. He found none. The estate now awaited the direction of someone else entirely. Elara descended the stairs, each footfall a testament to a woman who owed nothing to the former master, and everything to the resilience of a soul that had survived a long winter. She wore no veil. The silvery scar that trailed toward her jaw was illuminated by the rising sun, a mark of history that she no longer felt the need to apologize for. In her hand, she carried the silver skeleton key, the heavy instrument of her isolation that had spent 7 years in her mother's velvet-lined pocket. Baroness Beatrice watched her daughter approach, her expression a fragile mask of indignation that was rapidly crumbling into the hollow realization of her own insolvency. There was no shouting, for the Vances had always traded in the cold currency of decorum, but the air between them was thick with the scent of a debt finally called to account. Elara stopped a pace away and held out the key, the metal biting cold against her palm. She did not look at her mother with hatred. Hatred was a form of attachment she could no longer afford, but with the scrupulous clarity of a woman who had seen the bottom of every ledger. Baroness Beatrice reached out, her fingers trembling as they closed around the silver bow. It was the symbol of the door she had locked to preserve a vanity that was now as dusty as the east wing itself. Elara spoke then, her voice even and resonant in the quiet courtyard. She told her mother that the key was no longer for the door of a daughter's prison, but for the garden gate at the far end of the estate, the gate that led to the public road. She added that since the gate was currently missing its lock, the key would serve only as a reminder of a sovereignty that had ceased to exist. Beatrice took the key and entered the carriage, without a word, the click of the door sounding like the final period at the end of a long, dark sentence. As the carriage wheels crunched over the gravel, turning away from the house that had once been a mausoleum for the living, Elara did not look back. She turned instead to the house itself, which seemed to settle into the earth with a sigh of relief. The windows of the east wing, once dark and accusing, now caught the gold of the morning. It was no longer a wing of secrets. It was merely a part of a home. She felt the presence of Julian Sterling before she heard him. He stood in the shadows of the grand entryway, a man who had worn his grief like weather for 7 years, but who now looked upon the world with eyes the color of a clear, receding storm. He did not offer her a romantic platitude or a shallow comfort. He simply waited for her to reach the threshold, acknowledging her not as a victim he had rescued, but as a partner who had earned her place in the light. 3 months later, the east wing was no longer a place of dust and forgotten echoes. The heavy oak door that had once been a barrier stood permanently open, the hinges oiled and silent. The room where Elara had spent her years in the shadows had been transformed into a library and an office of administration, the walls lined with volumes of law, mathematics, and the history of the land. The scent of cheap beeswax and damp rot had been replaced by the rich, grounding aroma of sandalwood, expensive ink, and the sweetness of late-blooming lilacs. On a broad mahogany desk sat the Blackwood ledger, but it was no longer a record of decline. It was a clean volume, its pages white and expectant, a ledger that promised solvency not just in coin, but in character. Julian and Elara sat together at that desk, their chairs drawn close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed as they worked through the accounts of the Sterling estates. The physical proximity was a new language for them both, a slow consensual thawing of 2 hearts that had been frozen by different kinds of winter. Julian watched her as she calculated a complex interest rate, her ink-stained fingers moving with a precision that was, to him, the highest form of beauty. He did not see the scar as a flaw, nor did he see her past as a tragedy. He saw a woman whose intellectual competence had saved a house and whose integrity had saved a man. In 7 years, she was the first person who had looked at him and not seen a grave, and in return, he was the only person who had looked at her and seen the sun. He placed his hand over hers on the open page, the sterling seal on his finger catching the light. The silence in the room was no longer the silence that had teeth. It was the silence of two minds in perfect alignment. They had found their sanctuary in the honest architecture of a life built on truth and shared labor. Elara looked up at him, her grey eyes reflecting a future that was no longer a calculation of survival, but a poem of belonging. The mansion was no longer suspended in tension. It was breathing deeply, filled with the warmth of a hearth that had been cold for too long. True justice, it seemed, did not require the flash of a blade or the roar of a crowd. It was found in the quiet opening of a door and the profound safety of being truly seen.